Hey, welcome back to my Python tutorial. So far we've been using this program as online compiler, and it's pretty cool, but sometimes there's some other things you want to do. So if you have Python running on your local computer, you can get it running in a notebook like this, where you type in your commands, and then below the cell that you've typed them into, you get the output. So we can print something, but we can also just evaluate an expression without the print, and it'll tell us whatever the last return was. So we can do something like this. For I in range 10, so we're expecting 0 through 9, we see them come out. But we can also do some cool stuff that has a graphical output, which is something that we couldn't do in that programmer's environment. So this is using Seaborn, which is a graphing library. We're importing it. We'll talk about that later. And we're spitting out this graph of, in this case, it is the bill length versus body mass of different penguin species. And we can see that we could classify them using that. So we want to get Python installed, and we want to get Visual Studio Code installed, which is this guy here. So I'm just going to switch over to a fresh install of Windows and show you how to do this. It's fairly similar on Mac OS. On Linux, it's a little bit different. On Ubuntu, you'd use snap install code, and I'll go through those commands towards the end. So we're just going to open up Python. We're just going to open up Chrome and search for download Python. And you're going to get to this page. So just clicking download Python. The download is pretty quick. Now, if you don't have admin access to your computer, you're going to need to unclick this, and you'll see that lets you install it without admin access. And in general, adding it to the path can't hurt. So we're just going to click install. While that's installing, we're going to search for Visual Studio Code. Just click on this download link here. And I'll download that for Windows. And the download started. So our Python install is almost done. It's installing pip here. Pip is a package manager for Python, and we'll see that in a moment. I'll show you how to use it. It'll come in kind of handy. So I'm just going to run a command prompt. So we can type Python -- version, and we can see that we've got Python 396 installed here. And we can take a look at pip. So when you're using Python, you might want to use libraries, which are chunks of code that don't come with base Python, but other things you might want to use. So we can pip install. And again, if you don't have admin access, -- user here can help. We're going to install Pandas, which is a data manipulation framework, and Seaborn, which is the library that we use to produce that graph that we showed earlier on. So you can see pip goes off and downloads these guys. It's going to install them. In the old days, you used to have to download, compile from source, get all the dependencies. It was an absolute nightmare. So things like pip make things really easy these days. While this is installing, I'm going to come back here and install Visual Studio Code. This one should be pretty easy. I don't think there's any special stuff we need to do. So we'll accept the agreement, install it to wherever it wants to install, and let that run. So coming back to pip, this has now downloaded all of the packages it needs to, and it's finished the install. It's told us here that we're running a slightly old version of pip. So we're running 21.13 when 21.24 is available. And it's told us the command that we can run to fix that. So I'm just going to run that command. And this will update the version of pip that we're using. That really wasn't necessary, but it can't hurt. Cool. Coming back to Visual Studio Code install, it's finished. And it wants to launch. So Visual Studio Code can be used for a bunch of programming languages in a bunch of situations. For now, we're just going to use it for Python and Jupyter. So it's got some icons along the side here. First of all, it's got the Explorer, and it's asking us what folders we want to open. So I'm just going to go to my desktop, create a new folder called PY for my Python programs, and open that. It asks us if we trust the author of the PY directory. I'm going to say yes, we do, because we just created it. That's because it's got some intelligent stuff that runs over that directory. It doesn't want to be vulnerable to any exploits. So down here on the side, we've got extensions. This is what lets you use different languages and different environments within Visual Studio Code. We're going to install the Python extension and the Jupyter extension. They're going to take a second to download. You can see up here it's still working, and we've got this installing status down here. While that's running, just going to clean up some stuff because we don't need this anymore. We're not going to be using the Compiz environment anymore. We're going to be using Jupyter notebooks because they're a really nice interactive way of approaching Python. And it also means that you're running on your computer. So you can install all the libraries that you want to use, and we're going to start using more and more libraries to achieve the things that we want to achieve. So pretty soon these guys are going to finish installing, and we're going to have an environment that we can use. In the meantime, worth mentioning, there's a help menu up here if you run into any problems. And VS Code will ask you if you're interested in tutorials as stuff installs. It looks like our libraries are finished installing. So now in this directory here, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it test.ipynb. This stands for IronPython Notebook. IronPython or IPython was just the old way of referring to Jupyter. So when we create that, Visual Studio Code will know that we're creating a notebook. And I can type in here, print hello. Now, it won't work right off the bat because Visual Studio Code sees that we don't have Jupyter installed, and it says, hey, do you want me to install it for you? So I'm going to click on install here. This goes off and just runs the command in a terminal to install Jupyter. And we can see here that it's just going to, sorry, it's just scrolled off screen, but it's going to run pip, and it's going to install Jupyter and a few other things. So while this is installing, you can Google Jupyter Notebook. And at jupyter.org, there's some really good information about other things that you can do with Jupyter Notebook. It runs in the browser. It can do some cool stuff. Definitely worth Googling and checking out. You can see here they've got examples of how to use inputs, which is something that we'll talk about eventually, and how to have dynamic outputs based on those inputs. So Jupyter is installing. I might cut the video here and come back when it's finished installing. Well, that was pretty quick. Whether or not I'll cut that in the tutorials, we'll find out. So here, when we click play, the first time you click play, it'll take a few seconds to fire up the kernel in the background. And then we'll get our output. So there's a few things that we can do here, right? We can print something to the terminal, and that'll print. We can just put an expression in, and we don't need to print it. Jupyter will show us the last return that we actually had here, which is kind of cool. I'll get us some more space here. So we can do something like for I in range 10, print I, and we'll get our output. You might notice that while I was typing, we've got some suggestions here. This is one of the main reasons that we wanted to start using some kind of real development environment instead of just a web browser with a compiler. Working in a modern integrated development environment, or IDE, your IDE will tell you when you've made mistakes. So we can see here that this is red. It's got a red squiggly underline because one AAA doesn't make any sense here. But if we put in for I in range 10, print I, you can see that it works. Something else that we get here is we get the ability to show something graphical. So I'm going to import Seaborn that we installed earlier. And Seaborn comes with some data sets built into it. So if we import Seaborn and ask it what data sets it's got for us to play around with, this is going to take a second just to load up the library for the first time. It'll show us that it's got a data set in here called penguins. So we're going to load that data set and we're going to store it as a variable called df. If you're not keeping up here, don't stress too much. I'm going to put together a whole tutorial series on data science and how to use things like pandas and Seaborn to go through things. But for now, just appreciate that we can do some cool stuff. So if we do a scatter plot with data equal to df, before we do that, let's just take a look at what actually comes out of this load data set. So we can see here that we've got a chunk of columns. We've got species, island, we've got a bill length, bill depth, a body mass, a gender. So let's just graph this out and see how it looks. So let's grab bill length and put it in X. Let's grab maybe body mass, put it in Y. And as a color, grab the species. I've used the wrong function here. Pair plot's something else. We'll take a look at that in the future. We wanted a scatter plot, so we want to plot the bill length against the mass. So this is what we'll end up running. And we can see that we get this chart out the other side, which is pretty cool. So on the y-axis, we've got the body mass. On the x-axis, we've got the bill length. The color shows us what species it is, and you can see that just this plot is pretty good for distinguishing these different species of penguin from each other. So that's Visual Studio Code. Give it a shot, install it, see how it goes. If you're running on Ubuntu, I told you I would tell you what commands to run to install it. So sudo snap install code -- classic. We'll use the Snap framework to install Visual Studio Code, and you'll probably have to sudo apt install python 3-pip just to get pip installed. So if you do that instead of the downloads and installs that we did at the beginning, then just launch Visual Studio Code and install the extensions as you would have. I'll catch you next time for the next tutorial.